Okay, then welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl, and I will be today's moderator. It's actually great to see so many people early in the morning or maybe late at night, depending on where you are around the world. Our today's speaker is Anna Clark with the topic, the historiographical imagination. Anna is, I have to read that out, Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the Australian Centre for Public History at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia. So next to being a distinguished historian, she's also a Future Fellow. Anna has published widely on public history and Australian history and the history of Australian historiography, that way around, yes. Among her many books, I want to name just a few. There's The History Wars with a colleague together, which was received prizes and was also very well received in the general public. There is Teaching the Nation, but she has also written a history of fishing in Australia, from what I understand, and 2 books on history for children. So she has a very wide range of academic engagement with the past, academic and otherwise, in different forms of engaging with it. From what I understand, or we just talked about it before, Anna told me today's talk is based on a book that just came out. It's called Making Australian History, and it came out like 2 weeks ago, and I encourage you all to check it out. And yes, that's we also, beyond her obvious expertise, we're also very happy to have Anna, because she's our first speaker ever to sort of directly phoning in, if you like, from Australia, from the other end of the world. And we are very grateful to her because it's 9 hours ahead of us. We are in the morning and it's early in the evening. We had one speaker from Australia before, Marnie Hughes Warrington, but she visited us in Oulu, and that's now sort of like a few years ago, and it seems like now it's a different era or something, the travel restrictions currently. But I think if anything good comes out of the current time is that we can meet in an event like this across sort of geographical time boundaries and all other boundaries, hopefully. Now I'm nearly finished, don't worry. Just one more thing. This is the first event in our spring seminar series. I just want to tell you our next event is the 31st of March, and it will be Mariana Imas Scheinbaum from the University of Mexico City on the narrative sublime. And I'll invite you all to check our homepage and social media. There you'll find more information about our seminar. Also about then in April and May, where we'll have further events. And of course, once you are there, please also consider following our social media. And now, one last thing before I give the word to Anna, technicalities. Please mute yourself during the talk to avoid sort of unnecessary disturbance. And then after Anna's talk, there will be a discussion session that I will moderate. So if you have any question or comments in the discussion session, please indicate so first in the chat. I will make a speakers list. Then when it's your turn to speak, you can either write the question in the chat and I will read it out, or you can speak up yourself, unmute yourself with or without camera. And people that haven't spoken yet, we will prioritize, so they will move up on the speakers list and speak first then. That was it for me. Thank you again, Anna. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thanks, Georg. It's really lovely to be here tonight, calling in from a very thunderstormy Sydney. Apologies if a huge flash of lightning or clap of thunder interrupts my talk. It's quite spectacular. It's really, as Georg said, it's so nice to be able to feel like I'm part of a community. It has been incredibly isolating the last couple of years for all of us. So it's great to feel like these conversations are beginning again in such a welcoming way. Before I properly begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm phoning in tonight from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Australia. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge them as the traditional owners and story keepers for the country that I'm ringing from tonight. It feels quite an important acknowledgement to make in this case, because I'm talking about the discipline of Australian history tonight, and history making, of course, has taken place in what we now call Australia for thousands of generations. With this paper, I suppose I'm trying to recognise and mark out how the history discipline has been part of the architecture of colonisation, policing whose stories can be told and by whom. But I think history can also play a really important, even vital role in truth-telling and reconciliation, as many of the texts in this paper advocate. Seeking justice, remembering, and addressing Australia's past and, you know, the pasts of other settler colonial nations is a really ongoing and necessary condition of collective healing, I suppose, and recognition. I'll share my screen here. So this talk emerges out of a larger project that Georg mentioned, which is a history of Australian historiography. And it's with great relief that I finally finished, and now I don't know what to do. But anyway, I can sort of rest on my laurels for a little bit. The motivation for doing this work was born really out of a curiosity about the professional and public historical debates that we've had in recent decades in Australia, but of course all around the world, around the so-called history wars. You know, we've seen them in the US, in Japan, in Germany, in the UK. What history do we teach? What's the purpose? What's the role and function of a national history? You know, and contests over what version of the past people should be remembering in their national history. What I find very curious, certainly in the Australian context, and it'd be interesting to see other comments from you all around the world, is despite that contest and despite those really clear shifts in historical interpretation that have taken place, certainly in recent decades, there hasn't been a comprehensive history of history in Australia. Nothing, ever. And that gap was, I guess, the prompt for me to start thinking about, you know, what do these different interpretations mean and how have they changed over time? But in writing this book, I was immediately faced, of course, with the question of what is history? If I was to write a follow-up to E.H. Carr's famous text, what do I allow in my kind of remit or disciplinary remit of historical studies? And who do I include as a historian? Now, I take a pretty open and inclusive approach to answering this question. I see that history, of course, is a discipline, the subject that's taught in schools and universities, with established rules and methods and codes, as well as structures of archives and evidence. Yet diverse and meaningful practices of understanding the past obviously exist outside the discipline. So I suppose I've written this book and this paper with an understanding that history curates the past, but also with an ethical obligation to peer behind the scaffold of the discipline to interrogate that process of curation. So thinking about what is and isn't history, and also think about those processes of inclusion and exclusion. My area of expertise is Australian, but I hope and I think the questions about the discipline and historical imagination that creative histories raise, that I'll be looking at in this paper, are really transnational ones. Of course they are, they have to be. And they're especially relevant in settler colonial contexts where history has been vital to both the process of colonisation, by historying these places, by deciding what is history and who is a historian. So this evening, I really want to look at that question of what I've called the historiographical imagination, to ask whether those of us who study the discipline might be able to draw on more creative modes of history making to better understand that question about the purpose and function of history, as well as our own practices as historians. So I'm going to really focus on one text today that I came across when I was researching my book. I can't remember when I first read this poem. It's by Aboriginal writer Tony Birch, and it's called Footnote to a History War. But when I did first come across it, I distinctly remember thinking it was one of the best pieces of history that I had come across. It's based on letters between Aboriginal people living on reserves and missions and the relevant authorities within the Victorian government. So all of the lines from this poem come from the archive. It's a conversation that Birch produces in this poem, and it's produced a very sort of stilted, to and fro, but I find it deeply moving, and the sparseness of the historical work, I think, adds to its power. The two parts reproduced here give a very brief sense. There are several more, which I encourage you to look up, but they give a sense of what Birch himself describes as the poem's call and response structure. between the voice of the archive on the one hand and the voice of Aboriginal people. And I'm just going to read these two pieces out. My colour debars me, my child is dead, and I am lost. We are broken into parts, our home left in the wind, and it grows colder here. My wife is Aborigine, I am half caste, and I am, sir, dutifully yours. I await your response. He wears a suit issue number 6, hat issue number 7, and possesses 1 pair of blankets. She has on loan 1 mullet net and 2 perch nets. Their children are gone. 1 toxemia, 1 pneumonia, 1 ditto. Over 10 parts, Birch's correspondence and their institutional protectors, these are, over the period of many decades, Aboriginal people were held on reserves and controlled by Aboriginal protectors. And this poem is drawn from the correspondence between these essentially inmates and their protectors, I should say. This poem really, over the course of the poem, it really paints a very harrowing picture of government control and Indigenous desperation. These were lives lived under constant surveillance and regulation for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. Many of you might be familiar, or some of you might be familiar with the Aboriginal Protection Acts, which were enacted by successive governments in Australia from the 19th century until well into the mid-20th century, that controlled most aspects of Indigenous people's lives, where they worked, who they married, where their children could live, if they could go to school, etc. Entire bureaucracies were devoted to the control of Aboriginal people in Australia. The fact that these Indigenous lives were assiduously recorded in the archives, as Birch alludes to, but are largely absent from the actual history, the Australian national story, produced during the same period, is, I think, a stunning hypocrisy of the discipline. Birch's footnote to a history war was written in the wake of heated public debates on Australia's colonial legacy and collective memory, known as the history wars. But I think it forms a coda that's really, it's not neat in any way. This footnote is both haunted and deeply haunting, I think. Birch offers a lament for Aboriginal voices from the archives, while also pressing the institutions that uphold those same archives to acknowledge their own part in the architecture of Aboriginal subjugation. While the assemblage of this poem is creative, he takes excerpts and places them side by side to construct mood, form, and shape. The poem itself, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is composed from archival sources, and the emotion of them is not confected, as Birch explained in an email exchange between us as I was doing this research. He wrote to me, "The essence of the poem is lifted directly from the archive, either being letters written by Aboriginal people living on reserves and missions, or from colonial correspondence. I then created a collage of the phrases, words, and inventories and reassembled them in narrative form. What I didn't do was invent a mood or emotion. I wanted the poems I built to represent the intention of the original writing." He's essentially curating these sources. As poetry, it's so poignant, I think, but also very pointed. As a form of history, and that's what I'm interested in getting into in this talk, I think it leads us to really confronting truths about the past and about the discipline itself, if we allow it to. Poetry wasn't Tony Birch's first foray into Australian history. When I was a PhD student at Melbourne University about 20 years ago, he was a rising star of the history department and had recently completed an award-winning PhD thesis on the history of an inner Melbourne suburb of Fitzroy. But the discipline wasn't capacious enough, I think, or critical enough for Birch's writing and history making, which was made clear to him, as he describes it, when the history wars erupted. And when he attended a conference at the State Library of Victoria, he says he was confronted by the limits of the discipline in the midst of the history wars. He wrote in a chapter about this some years later, "I realised to my dismay that it did not matter how conscientiously I and other scholars applied ourselves to our research, how balanced we attempted to be in the presentation of our work. We had not realised that the history war was a dirty war, a guerrilla war, with no rules and no respect for convention. It was a day that I remember with great lucidity, as it was while I was sitting in the theatre that I came to the realisation that I no longer wanted to teach history. By way of response, Birch turned to creative writing, which enabled him, he says, to write more freely and apply that critical lens of the outsider to look back on the history discipline. Like his turn away from history, Birch's motivation for those archive box series came from his exasperation and frustration with the history wars. Historians' fixation on the accuracy of their sources, left, right, truth, untruth, how many people were killed, what's a crime. That sort of fixation, he thought, overlooked a deeper moral reckoning that was required of their discipline's role in passing Aboriginal people, in kind of editing and curating real lives. When the archives of the welfare and the protection boards accounted for people in the same way that they counted sheep and shirts and fishing nets, as that they offered to women in their protection, men and women in their protection, they reveal a really perverse mode of record keeping, he says, that was at once banal and about nothing, but it was also deeply dehumanizing. What does it say about that type of archive which refuses to engage with the human condition? Birch asks pointedly. The archive box, he said, series of poems should be considered as both a creative and political statement in response to the rhetoric of authority that is often constructed around empirical history. Such history is a genre that too often disguises its own subjectivity and ideological motivation behind something that, while referring to itself as the truth, denies the truths contained in any competing narratives. So with that poem as his kind of riposte to the history discipline, Birch reaches inside the archive, prizing it open and demanding that it speak. 15 years after writing the poem, he reflected quite lucidly on that process. He said, I decided I wanted to interrogate the archive in a different way. And that came out of the dissatisfaction with the whole history wars debacle, which was supposedly around the history profession arguing over footnotes again, and me saying it's something much more than a footnote. Describing the history wars as a travelling circus, Birch suggested it had done more to stifle the voices of Aboriginal people in recent times than a boatload of imperial warlords armed with gunpowder and a compass. In response, he said, the poem was a way of interrogating the archive and giving it a voice that it might not otherwise produce. My use of the archive, he said, is subjective, strategic, and selective, as is all historical research, he admitted. I truly believe that the notion of objectivity is a fiction. In Footnote to a History War, Birch uses the voice of the colonial authority followed by the voice of Aboriginal people, in his words, to consider how the voices of the frontier, the coloniser and Indigenous as somehow fused, created fuller meaning through a shared, if at times abrasive, refrain. That meditation on the past is repeated throughout the whole ArchiveBot series that he produced, and represents a deliberate detour away from the polarising discourse of that sort of historical guilt and pride that dominates the history wars, to pursue an actual dialogue, a historical dialogue across time and place. These pieces, which point out both the power and the limitations of the archive, were an important creative intervention into the history wars. But at the time Birch wrote Footnote to a History War, that creative historical space was having its own kind of war, certainly contest of sorts. It seemed historical imagination was as blurry and contested as the truth. I don't have to, tell you that history is an inherently creative practice. Of course it is. Our incomplete knowledge of the past inevitably means engaging with the space between the historical markers that we're more sure of, requiring leaps of imagination and working with wonder, as Marnie Hughes-Warrington advises. It was an urge to map historical imagination that prompted historians Anne Curthoys and John Docker to write Is History Fiction?, their 2005 sweeping survey of the discipline, which traces the enduring tension between the past and its interpretation. They wrote, can historians tell the truth about the past? Should history be written for the present or for its own sake? Is it possible to see the past in its own terms? Should we make moral judgments about people and actions in the past? Are histories shaped by narrative conventions so that their meaning derives from their form rather than the past itself? From Herodotus to Hayden White, history has prompted such musings about truth for 2,500 years, as Curthoys and Docker outline in their book. They're hardly new questions, they acknowledge. Historians are not and have never been united about how history ought to be written and how true their histories are. When E.H. Carr famously asked what is history in the title of his 1961 book, he determined the answer to be a constant dialogue between the present and the past. History depends on the historian's interpretation of it. That's where historical links are made, motives are assessed, and feelings from the past are connected to the present. Collingwood had implicitly mulled over the same question a generation earlier in his idea of history, in which he identified the centrality of historical imagination in the process of history making. So even the most, scientific historians, if you like, understood the limits of objective truth and the importance of creativity in their disciplinary craft. And it's this doubleness of history, to use Curthoys and Docker's term, that explains how historians constantly move and shift between what they know and what they don't. Those movements between knowledge and imagination. Dipesh Chakrabarty goes even further, suggesting that historical truth itself can be dependent on that leap of imagination, that in order to approach the truth about the past, one has to leave the present, he writes evocatively. Yet that space we might call historical imagination has been unsettling as well as creative. Debates about the collision of fiction and history provide a sense of those ongoing contests and disciplinary policing that Curthoys and Docker's book Is History Fiction highlights in its title. In recent years, historical novelists such as Hilary Mantel, Margaret Atwood and Kate Grenville have provocatively explored those dynamics of historical authority, truth and imagination. For Atwood and Grenville, moreover, it was their own settler-colonial contexts in Canada and Australia which prompted particular forms of historical fiction. We can see that lens to applied in Grenville's hugely successful novel, The Secret River, which has sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It's been an enormous bestseller. But we can see it as a self-conscious and deeply personal response to historical violence on the Australian frontier. For Grenville, historical fiction had the power to unlock certain historical silences that she saw in ways that were imaginative, creative, and of course, widely accessible, given the popularity of the novel. Some academic historians, of course, also sense the potential for fiction to enrich history. Carlo Ginzburg famously described how Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace provided the structure for his inspired microhistory of a 16th century Italian cheesemaker. Likewise, John Demos and Natalie Zeman Davis, both very successful American writers and historians in their own right, have identified the borderlands, as they describe it, between history and fiction as a catalyst for historical productiveness rather than disciplinary policing. Australian academic historians such as Anna Habich and Peter Reid have also found working with fiction to be productive, especially as an exercise in history making where the archival record is incomplete. While overly imaginative historical writing is sometimes criticised for reading like fiction, for being too fictional, the historian Alan Atkinson acknowledges that sometimes historical novels can uncover large truths about the past just as effectively as history wholly written to the evidence. What's more, it's the very creativity of historical fiction that enables its authors to capture places and pasts more vividly than most academic texts. Creative histories can be utterly transporting, as we know. These scenes and characters from the past that creep into readers' historical imaginations. They impact and craft the historical consciousness of the broader public in ways that disciplinary academic history can only dream of. Within 3 years, as I said, Grenville's Secret River had sold over 500,000 copies, sales that are absolutely inconceivable for an Australian history text, where I think a bestseller is considered to be 3,000 copies. Given this expanded reach and expression, surely there's a place in the historical canon for fiction and other forms of creative practice like Birch's poem. But the historian Inge Clendinnen has laid out clear distinctions between the two. She said, in my view, the largest single difference between history and fiction is that each establishes quite different relationships between writer and subject and writer and reader. She wrote this in a study of Holocaust historiography that included powerful fiction of Primo Levi, for example, alongside historical texts by Hannah Arendt and Gitta Sereni. Despite the imagination of historical practice, which she acknowledges, the distinction, as she describes it, between artfulness and artistic license is a line that absolutely cannot be crossed. And Clendinnen writes, historians must retrieve and represent the actualities of past experience in accordance with our rule, with patience, skepticism and curiosity, and with whatever art we can muster, provided always that the art remains subject to our rule. Faced with challenges of writing about something as incomprehensible as the Holocaust, Clendinnen surmised, history must not retreat from established disciplinary practice. Historians take the large liberty of speaking for the dead, she says, but we take this liberty under the strict rule of the rule of the discipline, and the rule is strict. Historians such as David Loventhal, John Tosh, and Mark McKenna, for example, have been similarly unsettled by the apparent proximity and tactility of creative histories, where the past is so close you can almost feel it. But that's unnerving. It's history unregulated by scholarly scaffolding, by peer review, research, and historical training. As someone very interested in history education and as a history educator myself, of course, this is a view I have sympathy with, given the imperative to teach disciplinary skills of historical thinking, of source criticism, research, and textual analysis in the classroom. Do we want students to just make it up? Of course we don't. That's not to say that disciplinary history isn't imaginative enough to account for certain gaps in the archive, but the rules are clear. Great history is imagination disciplined by facts, explains the historian Peter Cochrane. He describes historical imagination as a paradox of groundedness and transcendence, of weights and wings. Any reader of Clendinnen knows her work to be creative, inquisitive, and deftly attentive to silences and the possibilities and limitations of the archive, but it also absolutely holds the line. Understand what you can't know and don't go there. That's the historical contract. But in writing and thinking about this book, about the history of Australian history making, I was puzzled by the thought, this kind of repeated thought, which I got from Tony Birch's poem. What about when the historical contract feels broken? What if even the most imaginative history still marginalizes certain knowledges and perspectives? What if disciplinary history, that subject that's taught in school and universities, one I have trained in for 20 years, it has established professional associations and qualifications. What if it can't actually accommodate the voices that have been excluded before because its own structures preclude the very expansiveness that's required? What if it isn't possible to break out of history's own blind eyes, as Catherine Hall describes them so eloquently? These are the questions I get from reading Tony Birch's poem, Footnote to a History War. They're also questions that come to me when I'm sitting on the couch at my mum's place, of all places. In her house, I find myself looking at a painting by my late uncle, Harry Wedge, who was an Aboriginal, a Wiradjuri artist from Cowra, who married my aunt. It's been on the wall since I was a child. I used to find it very scary, but also riveting in the way that fairy tales are both mesmerising and menacing when you're little. Harry's painting shows the aftermath of an Aboriginal death on the frontier, but it's of course depicted allegorically. A fox trooper, i.e. British, introduced species, has killed a kangaroo man, an Indigenous man, while his wife, a kangaroo woman, weeps and pleads with the trooper next to the body of her dead husband. It's a deeply affecting image, referencing the history of introduced species, colonisation, on, country, and also kin. It's a work that really bristles and jars. Bright colours clash on the canvas while those great arcs of dots compose the scene of violence also roll across it like a meditation. It's that clash that prompts me to think about Harry's history making. Here was an Aboriginal man who couldn't read or write well. He grew up in a mission in rural New South Wales. So for him, the capacity to produce disciplinary history was completely out of reach, but he had a history to tell. Sometimes you have to be creative, I guess. So that impulse to reach beyond history's disciplinary limitations, I think, or I'm suggesting here, can be ethical as well as artistic. And in that sense, the rigid demarcation of historical imagination into either history or fiction feels perhaps a little bit too exclusive. There have been important interventions from both fields expressing precisely that idea. The African-American writer Toni Morrison describes how she found herself reaching for fiction in order to tell the truth, as she describes it, about slavery and its aftermath in the United States, because its actuality was too often hidden, submerged, and pushed aside in survivors' attempts to recover from its legacy. Yet this approach did not make her work untrue, as she writes. Memories and recollections won't give me total access to the unwritten interior life of these people. Only the act of the imagination can help me. She articulates how the crucial distinction for me is not the difference between fact and fiction, but the distinction between fact and truth. Or take the anthropologist and writer Epeli Haofa, a Pacific historian. Take his compelling critique of scholarly Pacific historiography, which he said relegated Indigenous pasts to footnotes in the histories of empire. Instead, what were needed, he said, were new Pacific histories and geographies. He described them as new choreographies that recentered Pacific experience. Haofa's writing is absolutely stunning, and I thoroughly recommend it to anybody interested in reading literature, Indigenous literature from the Pacific. And it's accompanied, I think, by a very punchy claim that intervenes in our understandings of the past, but also our understandings of history, the discipline, as an agent in that past. In Australia, similar interventions have pondered the history making of family stories, of songs, and even protests, as these images of the 1938 Day of Mourning in Sydney, in Australia, and the 1972 Tent Embassy in Canberra, demanding land rights, demonstrate. Such protests called for civil and political rights for land rights as well, for people whose narratives were largely excluded from the official national story in the mid-20th century in Australia. I think they also present a really vital counter-narrative of Australian history. Look at those images. One of them says, Day of Mourning, and the other one says, white invaders, you are living on stolen land. They're not just political slogans, they're also a reimagination of the Australian national narrative. I'm reminded also here of the work into First Nations family histories by the likes of Angela Wanala in New Zealand, Shino Kanishi in Australia, and Michael Marker in Canada, where even the very act of keeping and telling family stories presents powerful challenges to disciplinary knowledge and practice. By acknowledging these histories and history makers within the discipline, I think history as we know it could be turned on its head. Is it any wonder that the Gomeroi poet and legal scholar Alison Whittaker describes Aboriginal poetry as potent and powerful for the way it licks at the edges of the coloniser's language? I think Birch does this to the archive in his poem Footnote to a History War. That ethical dimension of using creative approaches to the past has also been taken up by non-Indigenous scholars working in settler-colonial contexts of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. For some, it's an urge to overcome what Chakrabarty called history's inbuilt inequalities that drives their historical imagination. I'm thinking particularly here of the ethnographic historian Greg Denning, who was prompted by gaps in the archival record to reach for more creative readings of the past. Describing histories of entanglement and contact in the Pacific, Denning realised early in his research that the sources were one-sided and selective? How do we tell the stories of empire and colonisation when its archives only partly remember them? And Denning explains in a beautiful quote the importance of imagination in these moments. Imagination is the ability to see those fine-lined and faint webs of significance. Imagination is hearing the silence because we have heard some of the sounds. Imagination is seeing the absent things because we have seen so much else. That is its dreamlike quality. It is built on rearranged experience. This understanding of history highlights how disciplinary structures can relegate and silence while also offering possibilities for imaginative and inclusive readings of the past. To borrow from the historian Miranda Johnson, these hyphenated histories, as she calls them, that use fiction, testimony, and linguistic diversity, have the capacity to extend the discipline and understand pasts and perspectives which have been occluded, kept out. It's also important to note that the use of creative histories, of course, has a genealogy, a long genealogy of its own, certainly in Australia. From the late 19th to the mid-20th century, when the act of disciplinary silencing of Indigenous history was at its peak, versions of the past echoed in verse and song and fiction from creative practitioners, like this novel about the Black Police by Arthur Vaughan, which did not shy away from the violence of the frontier, or The Timeless Land by Eleanor Dark, which is written from the perspective of an Aboriginal person in contact. This is historical fiction, of course, but Dark deserves recognition as a historian for the work she did with that text. And so in this attempt for us to sort of think about the sort of narratives that are circulating around Australia, I think it's important to consider how and why, where we delineate the lines of what is history and what isn't. Even within local communities, vernacular creative histories sometimes worked to confound the discipline's emissions. Silence wasn't total. When somebody called J.K. from the town of Brogo in rural New South Wales imagined the voice of an Aboriginal man, they sent it to the local paper as a poem, and it was written in verse. And while it's, problematic by today's standards and sentimentalised this idea of the last Aboriginal, it's also an indication, I think, that historical narratives circulating locally weren't necessarily grafted to that idea of Australian history as progress that the discipline was advancing at the time. If we look at this moment in 1884, and I'll read out the poem that was sent into the local newspaper. In white-winged ships, the white men came from far across the sea. They brought destruction, death and shame to us who once were free. They came not in a warlike guise with tramp and beat of drum. They conquered not by fire or sword. They vanquished us with rum. They filled us with their liquid fire till our untutored passions rose. Then to quell the tumult they had raised, they shot us down like crows. I really think it would have been impossible to write such a lament on the effects of colonisation as a sort of a historical piece in the local newspaper at the time, and it certainly did not appear in history texts of that year, at that time in the late 19th century. I couldn't find any explicit commentary on the history of frontier violence from that area in the local newspaper, but as a poem, that history was deemed sort of passable, which I find very interesting. I think there's something about that creative historical license that enabled vital counter histories to be produced and circulated in settler-colonial societies. Critically, I think, they broaden our historiographical lens to include other genres and ways of knowing the past. They have to, otherwise that whole quadrant of historiography is kind of taken out, and yet they were obviously moving around society. Creative histories are often uncomfortable, as the English public historian Jerome de Groot notes, for the ways they challenge, pervert, critique, and queer a normative, straightforward, linear, self-prescribing history. Yet they also open up discursive spaces where ideas about the past, desire, time, horror, nationhood, identity, chaos, legitimacy, and historical authority are debated. I don't mean that distinguishing historical forms from one another is meaningless. Far from it. Sometimes the differences between history and fiction are very important indeed, as Tom Griffiths, a historian, has firmly insisted. At times, the non in our non-fiction signifies an edge, he writes, that can sharpen our prose and heighten our sense of danger and wonder. But Griffiths also acknowledges that the jostling between history and fiction can be creative and productive rather than simply problematic. He writes, instead of defining a defining gulf between history and fiction, I see an intriguing dance around a shifting essential line. Tony Birch also emphasises the possibilities that creative approaches to the past engender. He writes, fiction can be an empowering way of understanding the past, as can visual culture, as can academic history. The greatest threat to recognition, in this case, the recognition of both Indigenous histories of Australia and the at times difficult terrain of colonial history, is silence, absence. In other words, history making of any sort that adds to our knowledge of the past and that accommodates and explores different voices and perspectives is preferable to those constrained by method or genre. Historical poetry and fiction might not be fixtures of scholarly historical training and expertise, but they have extended Australian history and historical understanding nonetheless. Sometimes those contributions have also presented a powerful critique of the discipline itself, as Birch's Archive Box series and this extraordinary poem from the Aboriginal Wiradjuri writer Janine Lean make clear. Cardboard incarceration coolly describes, she writes, a jail of captured snippets, images and memories among the severed heads and bleached bones of dismembered bodies tucked idly away in vaults and museums and universities of the world in the name of science or history or anthropology or something else trendy at the time. It's a really devastating account of disciplinary knowledge. So no, I don't think you can make it up. But sometimes historical imagination is required to understand the past, especially in settler-colonial societies like Australia, where access to historical recognition as a subject and author of history has been distinctly uneven. Given the creative work of Birch and Lean, I'd also argue that a little historiographical imagination is sometimes required to contemplate the questions, what is history and who is a historian? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Anna, for your talk. Great. Very enlightening. Right, we have now the discussion session. As I explained before, is there... Okay.
Just to jump in, is this concluding at 11 a.m., is that correct?
We have it, if you want to, yes.
Is that okay? Yeah, sorry, I've just got my children and going to bed.
We have it open, usually open-ended, but if you want to...
I can always leave and you guys can keep
going. No.
Awesome.
Then it's ending at 11. That's, oh yeah, okay, that's fine. So. Yes, that's why we have 15 minutes then for discussion. Yes, please.
Is there anyone online?
If you want to go, Joni-Matti, you can.
Well, I could begin by...
Yes, begin, please.
First of all, thanking for the very, very interesting talk. And
I hate university.
Okay. Well, something very, very interesting and new stuff for me to learn and know about Australian history. Just one thing I just wanted to ask, because it seems that there is an implied opposition between disciplinary and non-disciplinary history writing. And I'm just curious about what you think about this, whether, because you seem to be saying that disciplinary history can't really, I'm trying to come to, so the thought that disciplinary history can't really reach the other histories of the other, is it something, what do you think, is it contingent that, you know, of course, disciplinary history has changed a lot over the years. So is it something contingent, or is it something more a permanent kind of thing that prevents from it reaching it?
That's a fantastic question, and something I'm still grappling with. I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. Of course, history has changed over the years, and that's why we can even ask these questions in the first place. Like, I'm not the first person to ask these questions or to think creatively about historiography. I guess I'm wondering if whether we can use this model of a creative historiography to go back, even ahistorically, to go back in time and read other forms of history making as part of, not necessarily part of the discipline, but certainly part of the historical oeuvre or historical narratives that are being produced at the time, because they're not necessarily part of the canon, but they are part of the kind of sounds of history, if you like. And part of the narratives that are being produced and consumed. So I guess that the challenge that I was trying to wrestle with in this study is, the map of what history isn't changes over time. And if I am looking back in the 19th century at other forms of history making to try and understand, who is doing history and what's the diversity of historical approaches, I'm sort of interested in I think there's an ethical obligation to do that, but I'm also interested in what that does to the boundaries of the discipline when we do it over a long period of time, because I don't think there's any question today about history's capacity to reach into silences and turn to different methodologies to try and, democratize our understanding of the past. I think that kind of, these are questions that are very productive and have a lot of kind of interest. But given that history in the past was sort of part of the colonial project, how do we, I suppose, disentangle that in order to tell some of the more diverse history in that moment, particularly in a settler-colonial nation?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We should be good now too again in terms of participation. I'm very sorry for the short hiccup. We got some uninvited guests, but now everything is settled in the background, so don't worry anymore. Okay, thank you. Is there any further questions, comments, concerns, criticisms? I can give somebody else a little bit more time to maybe think about it. Two points maybe. One, could you maybe talk a bit more about then your book, The History of Making Australian History, sort of maybe the history of Australian historiography? Because from what I understand now, obviously, for all the exclusion and parochialism that there was now, obviously there's the push. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to show us all of that, and you wouldn't be aware yourself, in a sense, maybe if you had been born in a different time. So what do you think is the way forward now for Australian historiography? And the second point is, if you could, or what do you think what is the takeaway from your book, I guess, in a sense, or what are the main lines now, or the main schools, maybe the main interest topic-wise in Australian historiography? It will be interesting to me or in Europe, because I don't know much about Australian historiography. And the second point is sort of, you as a professional historian, and most of us here, I guess we have a deep interest in historiography and history as a disciplinary practice, and also as a sort of endeavor that gives us, as you also said, truth about the past, knowledge of the past. And then you also showed us these poems and all the lacunae and everything that is sort of left out, and even the problem of evidence, because a lot of people haven't left evidence because they weren't recorded properly. If you had to make then a sort of judgment call, is it a question of what do we want? Because we might be in a situation where a poem that is, call it true enough, gives us so much more in terms of political values that we might want, or in terms of equality and humanism, than any real knowledge-based historiography can give us. So in that sense, but but then again, in generally culture-wise, we all want to have discourse that are based on truth and knowledge, because that's also important. I mean, I guess it's the question of discourse and where we are at the moment. But I guess there's a tension there, right?
There's a big tension there, and there's a real, you know, how do we defend the discipline against accusations of, you know, relativism and fake news or you know, authority, and how do we teach students to distinguish between different versions of the past, because obviously there is a, you know, we need to be able to get them to understand the difference between uneducated opinion and well-researched historical opinion. I really wrestle with this, because in a way I wanted this book to really wanted to show that history, disciplinary history, you know, the sort of, I suppose, empirical history, came to Australia on the boats with the colonists, and it came as part of the act of colonisation. That bringing history to Australia essentially relegated Aboriginal history making to something that was unhistorical and prehistorical, that it didn't sort of fit in the logic of the national narrative. And of course, this has changed over time. So this book is really, I hope, a story of that kind of conversation between colonists and their origin and the practice of history over time, and how that has been increasingly challenged, obviously, in recent years, not only by Aboriginal challenges to the national narrative, but also the challenges of feminism, Marxist history, multicultural histories, post-structuralism, post-colonialism, and so on. And so, you know, the book is trying to look at this sort of sweep, using the case study of Australia, of I suppose, a history of history. And all the time it's posing, to go back to your first question, it's posing the question, I hope not too rigidly, but basically, can history decolonize? Or is it so bound up in the colonial project through its kind of architecture and through its methods that it can never fully sort of shed the disciplinary strictures and structures which relegated those other forms of history making. And I hope I come down on the side that history has become, you know, increasingly complex and more accommodating, and that's the way forward. Is this sort of one of the things about history is how, although we can identify the discipline from, say, you know, von Ranke, we can see ourselves in that, you know, in that form of history making 150 years ago, but at the same time, it has also changed very radically. And through this sort of continuity of practice and form, there's also been these kind of, it's been a great borrower, what we call a magpie, of taking on new forms and new critiques. And curiously, it has been a very self-critical discipline, I think, especially in the last 50 years, and has taken on its own criticisms and criticisms from outside the discipline, and taken them on to kind of continuously remodel itself, while also keeping those sort of structures and methods from its empirical origins.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, given what you said before, I think we had two more questions. Maybe we can shortly take them together, and you give a final answer, Anna, and then
sure.
We'll leave it at there. Okay. I think it was Kalle before, Kalle Pichleinen, right? Sorry, I forgot that. Was it? Did you raise your hand?
I had my hand up for a while.
Sorry. Then I jumped in. I'm sorry, I forgot that. And then Theo. No. And then please, Kalle.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say it's fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I agree with everything. My hand was up for things that Anna already said, so I don't want to take more time since we only have a few minutes.
Thanks, Kalle.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Cheers.
Okay, then it's to Theodoros Pelekanis. Theo, you have your hand raised? Yes, please. You have the last question.
Okay, so it was a very nice talk, and I also agree with everything you said, actually. I have a comment from a personal experience. Like I remember I was in Australia for a conference in genocide, and we went in Brisbane, in this Aboriginal cultural center. And I had this thought, because they gave us a part of their story through children's theatrical play and through poems and other sorts of histories apart from the traditional one, which was very nice. But at the same time, the whole promotion of this thing was a very westernized marketing thing, you know. And it is one thing, and I agree that history needs to have this artistic aspects, and you can understand much more about these people through this, because Western historiography just says things in one way or another from the Western perspective, and their voice cannot be heard. But on the other hand, I want to ask, what are really the chances these people have to express themselves, even through different ways of historicizing, if they are restricted to promote them through this always same Western ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I found very interesting in thinking about historiography, or the history of historiography, as a kind of a changing curation. If you can imagine a history textbook from 1850, and every year it gets republished, what's in and what's out? It's a very interesting question to think about, what's in and what's out. What do we think is important? What do we acknowledge as part of the national story? What do we want children to know about the nation? And that active curation, I think, is not only a kind of a didactic decision. It's also an act of listening. Whose voices are you listening to? It's because a lot of these kind of counter narratives are existing out in the world. They're being told through family histories, they're being expressed in communities, but who's listening? And what is the depth of that listening? So I think the story of historiography is also a story of a history of changing forms of listening, and that listening goes up and down over time. And so incorporating, allowing forms of history making that might not have to fit in a kind of an empirical Western register will require different forms of listening, I think. And so that's an obligation and a challenge, obviously.
Okay, then. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody else, for joining. We have come now, as it is our 11 o'clock. We've come to the end of this event again. I can only say thank you again to everybody, and check out Anna's new book and her other books and our social media. And I'll see you next time, hopefully next time in March at our next talk. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you, everyone. All the very best.